previously, where they were asking you why an investor would use borrowed funds instead of paying all cash for a purchase for a real estate investment. So remember, we were saying that if you could purchase this apartment and you were paying a lower interest rate than it was actually giving as a yield. So if this property were yielding J2 equals 7 and you were to mortgage part of it for J2 equals 4, then it would pay for itself and you would be fine to pay that 4% because you were earning 7%. Or you could take part of the funds that you would have used to pay for this property and you could invest it elsewhere and make even more money, maybe by being the lender and purchasing a mortgage loan, or maybe investing in a construction project that would yield you J2 equals 12. Okay, so that was what we had discussed in the earlier question. There are some other reasons as well as to why an investor would use borrowed funds. So if they just don't have enough money in the bank. So if they don't have enough money in the bank, well, then obviously they're going to need to borrow and mortgage some of the property's purchase price. If they wanted to use some of the equity, or if they wanted to use some of their savings to make improvements on the property. So maybe they want to fix the elevator, or they want to renovate the suites. And if they do that, then it will actually allow them to earn even more money on this project, because then it'll be nicer and they can rent the suites for more. The other thing is that when you're investing, you don't always want to put your money in one place. So you reduce your risk by investing in multiple projects in multiple areas. So if you were to buy this apartment building and invest in some mortgages and become the lender, and then maybe go and invest in some other construction projects, it actually spreads your risk out between multiple projects. And so if something happens to one of them, something bad happens to one of them, you don't risk all of your money because you've got some here and you've got some here. Okay, so the correct answer for this one is all of the above. Now this one is slightly different, right? It's asking which one is not the reason. So none of the answers that were correct can be the answer, right? Because they are reasons. So answer number 4 is now the correct answer for this one, and it's to invest the borrowed funds at a lower rate of interest than the borrowing rate. So it's worded kind of strangely for this one, but what they're saying is, if you had this apartment building and you were paying this rate of J2 equals 4, you wouldn't keep aside money to invest it elsewhere if the investment that you were putting it into were only earning J2 equals 2. Because you're only earning 2% and you're having to pay 4%. So in that case, you would want to pay and use cash to purchase this, because you were going to lose money if you were going to invest it in that J2 equals 2 investment. Okay, so you wouldn't invest it at a lower rate than what you were borrowing. You always want to invest it at a higher rate than what you're borrowing, because then that means you're making more money than you're paying. Okay, all other things being equal, shortening the contractual term on a constant level payment mortgage always has the effect of what? So hopefully you know from what we already discussed previously that if we shorten the term, okay, if we have a 2-year term instead of a 5-year term, what is that going to affect? Well, we said that term affects outstanding balance. It doesn't affect the payment amount, it affects the outstanding balance. So if you shorten the contract, right, 2-year term will have a higher outstanding balance than a 5-year term. Why is that? Because you're making payments for 3 years more. So it will increase the size of the outstanding balance payment that's due at the end of the term. So remember, we said it doesn't do anything to the payments, doesn't increase them or decrease them or do anything. It doesn't affect the interest rate when we're talking about a constant level payment mortgage. So we're not talking about a bonus mortgage in this question. We're going to do those ones a little bit later. And it doesn't do anything to affect the payment frequency. Okay, so this first one, 551, is just a simple definition question. What is a constant payment mortgage? It's one where the payments don't change. So each payment is identical to the preceding one. So this is typical mortgage lending, typical, all of lending, right? Car loans and all that kind of stuff. Usually your payment stays exactly the same. So number 2 is incorrect. It says that the payments are comprised of a constant amount of principal plus interest due. No, actually that's false. It's a changing amount of principal and interest. The payment is the same, but the amounts that go towards the interest and the principal change every single month. The payments decrease in size during the term of the loan. No, that is talking about a straight line principal reduction loan. And your principal and interest are the same amount for each payment. No, we said it's a changing amount of interest and principal. So in the beginning, you'll have more interest and less principal. And then at the end, that will switch and you'll have more principal and less interest. Okay, so 574 is saying when casual reference is made to the current mortgage lending rate, the common practice is to quote what? So this is the common practice, the nominal interest rate. So this is the rate without any fees or without any compounding interest. So we say that the nominal is just a J rate, okay? It's not common practice to quote the effective annual interest rate. They can, but it's not common practice to. It's not common practice to quote equivalent interest rate. That doesn't even mean anything. And it's not common practice to quote a per compounding period, which is a periodic rate. This one is, next one is 587 is asking for the definition of what the secondary mortgage market is. So we talked about that in an earlier question. It's the market in which existing mortgages are bought and sold as financial investments. So it's not when the borrower receives the funds secured by a mortgage from a bank. That's previous to this happening. So the mortgage was initiated maybe from a bank, and then it's being bought and sold by investors down the line. Number 3 is false because it says the secondary mortgage market has been weakened by the introduction of mortgage-backed securities and Canada mortgage bonds, and that's actually false because the introduction of these things has actually strengthened the secondary market. And number 4 is saying that it's the market in which the mortgage loans are initiated. No, that's not true, because they're usually initiated right from the banks and the primary lenders, and then the secondary market is the place where investors come to buy and sell. Okay, so 589 is asking about a constant payment repayment scheme. And they're saying, what did it develop in response to? What is the reason why we have constant payment schemes that are set up in mortgages? Well, if you know what these are made of, so the constant payments, our payments nowadays are made of both interest and principal. So when I say principal, I'm meaning the PV, okay? So the payments work to pay back the principal, the PV that was borrowed, and it slowly pays the interest that's promised in the mortgage contract. And the reason why these kinds of payments and this kind of payment scheme was developed was in response to our principal risk. So as a lender, your principal, this here that's being paid back in each payment little by little, it's at risk for the entire time that you're in a contract with that borrower. And nowadays, we have what's called an amortization period that gets us eventually to that zero balance, right? We have no outstanding balance, we have no future value, okay? So we don't owe any money anymore at the end of that amortization period. Well, prior to these constant payment schemes being developed, that usually didn't happen. So early in, prior to the Depression, 1900 to 1920s, residential mortgage financing was long-term loans, and the interest was paid periodically through the life of the loan. And sometimes there were partial payments of the principal that were made, but a lot of times it didn't happen. So the entire principal amount was repaid, or in a lot of cases refinanced at the end of the loan term. So what is this talking about? This is really describing interest-only loans, okay? Interest accruing is where you would pay nothing, right? And you would owe all the principal and the interest at the very end. But this is, for the most part, it was an interest-only loan situation that happened prior to the development of these new payment schemes that we have. Now, the problem that occurred was the Depression. When the Great Depression happened in the 1930s, people couldn't actually pay anything. So all they could manage was feeding themselves and making sure that they didn't die every day, right? It was a very, very bad time for a lot of people who had debt. And it was a very bad time then for lenders as well, because they found that they were owed everything, the principal that was outstanding, and in most cases, the borrowers couldn't even pay any of the interest. So they weren't making their money, they weren't earning their interest on that principal, because a lot of people didn't have any jobs, right? In the Great Depression, most people didn't have an income, and the properties themselves were worthless because they couldn't just be sold to anybody, because nobody had any money and nobody wanted to purchase. So these payment schemes developed as a response to that, so that the principal wasn't at risk all the time for the entire length of the loan, and possibly refinanced at the end of it all, because it was being paid back little by little as part of the payments that we have nowadays in our modern types of loans. Okay, so 632 says a borrower who makes accelerated biweekly payments does what? So they pay 1/2 of the monthly payment every 2 weeks. That is true. So hopefully you remember from your accelerated biweekly questions that we always started with a payment frequency of 12, and we accelerated that by cutting that monthly payment in half, and then we were able to make that payment every 2 weeks. So that meant that when we paid that half monthly payment every 2 weeks, we could make 26 payments in a year. So answer number 1 says that you will make smaller number of payments in a calendar year than a borrower who makes constant monthly payments. That's false, because you actually make more, right? Half of the monthly payment, but you get to make it every 2 weeks, so you end up paying 26 times, right, instead of 12. It says you will pay more interest over the life of the loan than the borrower who makes constant monthly payments, with all of the loan terms being equal. That's not true, because you're actually able to make the payments more often, and you're able to make them 26 times a year. You end up paying more on your principal than if you were to pay monthly. So let's say that you have this monthly scheme and you have 12 $1,000 payments in a year. That would let you pay $12,000 per year. And part of that, remember, is going towards your PV, and the rest is going towards the interest. Okay. If you're switching to this accelerated biweekly, then you get to pay half of this monthly payment, so $500 per month, and you get to pay that payment 26 times in a year, because you get to pay every 2 weeks. So if you multiply that 500 by 26, multiply that 500 by 26, you actually are able to pay an extra $1,000. And that extra $1,000 goes directly towards the PV. So that extra $1,000 goes all towards the PV, and you're paying the same amount of interest in that year. So you're going to pay down your loan a little bit faster, which means that you're going to pay less interest over the life of the loan, not more. Okay, you're going to pay less interest over the life of that loan because you're going to pay it down sooner. Number 3 says you pay 1/12 the annual payment every 2 weeks. So if we do that math on paper, it's really silly what they're trying to suggest. So if the annual payment, let's just take this 12,000, right? Our monthly payment is 1,000 per month. So if we take the 12,000 per year and we divide it by 12, then we get our $1,000. And they're saying you can make that payment every 2 weeks. So they're suggesting that you can actually take this monthly payment and make it 2 weeks, and that is incorrect. That is false. You're going to take half of that monthly payment, and you can make that every 2 weeks. Okay, so that's why answer number 3 is also incorrect. All right, so hopefully you know that the answer to this first one, 640, is that an interest accruing loan is the most risk to the lender. Okay, so interest only loan is risky as well, but it's not quite as risky as the interest accruing loan. The straight line principal reduction is actually not risky to the lender at all because you're paying down that mortgage really quickly. So that's a great situation for the lender. And a constant blended payment loan is the least risky between these three because again, that payment consists of both the present value and that interest. So they're both being paid back in this loan. So the interest accruing loan is definitely the riskiest type for the lender. Another question about a characteristic of a mortgage as an investment. In this case, they're asking for which one is not. And hopefully you know that by now it's a high degree of administrative work that's required for mortgages and not a low degree of administrative work. So that means that all of these are characteristics. So mortgages are unique, absolutely. They do require a high initial outlay of capital. And you have another true answer choice here, that smaller investors face a mortgage payment reinvestment problem. So this goes back to the investment question when they were asking about why an investor would want to pay cash or not pay cash and have it financed when they're purchasing properties. Same thing for mortgages. So for mortgages, you have that high outlay of capital, and how are you getting that paid back to you? You're getting that paid back to you a little bit at a time in the form of payments. So if you're only getting a little bit of your capital back at a time, then you can't reinvest it in a large lump sum because you're only getting, $1,000 per month, and you have to wait for a really long time before you get that money back. So reinvesting definitely is a problem when you decide to be a mortgage lender. Okay, so these are, again, similar questions, similar but not similar. One says which ones are private lenders, and the other one says which is not a private lender. So all three of these are private lenders, and you see that the answer choices are exactly the same in the not version of the question. So mortgage corporations, vendors who are carrying out vendor-supplied mortgages, right? So they're giving part or all of the purchase price for the purchase of a property. Trust companies whose estate and trust funds are invested in mortgages. So this could be your REIT, your real estate investment trust, right? So all of those are considered to be private lenders. A credit union is not a private lender. Credit unions are part of the public lending pool. Okay, so 705 is asking which of the following mortgage repayment schemes do the monthly mortgage payments increase on a regular basis? So this is your graduated payment mortgage. So remember we were talking about graduated payment and straight line principal reduction. When you have a graduated payment, your payment starts out really small and it gets to be really large at the end. And the reason for that is because you want that payment to increase along with your income that's increasing over time. Okay, straight line principal reduction was the opposite. Straight line is actually decreasing with your income decreasing. Interest accruing, we don't have payments at all, so that doesn't apply. And reverse annuity mortgages, the RAM mortgages, is actually when the lender pays you. So you take some equity out of your property and the lender makes payments to the borrower to give them that equity in little pieces at a time. Number 739 is saying which of the following loans is the lender's initial capital and periodic income at greatest risk. Hopefully you know by this time that the answer for that is interest accruing loans, right? Because no payments are made and the entire amount that's borrowed and all of the interest is collected at the very end. So again, interest-only loans are risky. They're just not as risky as interest accruing loans. Constant payment loans, we said in another question prior, yes, it's a mortgage, so it's risky to the lender, but it's not as risky as the interest only or the interest accruing because that payment is paying back both the principal and the interest. Okay, so it's paying it back little by little, so it's less risk than the interest only loan. And the straight line principal reduction loan, we just said, is not actually risky to the lender because you're paying that down really, really quickly. So the lender likes that because they're getting the principal back really, really fast. All right, so 758, hopefully you can read this. It's asking what's going to happen when the amortization period of a loan is lengthened. So I'm finally going to explain all of this stuff that you've seen on the other questions. So what's going to happen is that the outstanding balance at any point in time along that length of the amortization is going to be higher. So it'll be increased compared to a shorter length for the amortization. Okay, so it's kind of implied in the question, in the starting statement, that they're wanting you to compare a shorter amortization to a longer one. So I've got a 20-year amortization here and a 25-year amortization in a number line. And so what happens, what do we know that happens to the payment when we lengthen the amortization? Well, the payment actually decreases. So I've got that reflected here in a $900 payment for the 25-year amortization and a $1,000 payment for the 20-year. Okay, so the payment will decrease because you get to spread that PV repayment over a longer period of time. Yes, you're paying more interest because it's a 25-year amortization, but those are also stretched, right? That interest is also stretched over a greater amount of time. So what ends up happening is these smaller payments pay less to the PV with each payment. So you can see if I make $1,000 payment per month here, I'm going to pay my PV down quicker because I'm putting more towards my PV every month, every time I make that payment. Whereas when I stretch it out over a 25-year period, I'm paying less towards my PV because I only have $900 to go towards that payment. Yeah, there's going to be a little bit more interest in there, but the majority of the effect is on how much of the PV you're going to be able to repay. Okay, so at any point in time, the outstanding balance after each payment is going to be higher on this 25-year amortization, and it will be lower on this 20-year amortization. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Remember, the term length also does affect your outstanding balance, but the amortization can affect both the payment and the outstanding balance. Okay, so this question is just factual, really. It goes back to some of the other information that we were talking about when we were talking about constant repayment schemes and the Depression information and what loans were before the Depression in the 1900 to 1920 time frame. Okay, so between 1900 and 1920, remember I was saying that most of the loans were interest-only loans. Because the principal was seldom paid back, and a lot of times it was actually refinanced. So they're asking you to just fill in the blanks with this one, okay? So when I know that they're referring to 1900, 1920, I can think, okay, it was pretty simple back then, right? There was none of this principal interest being paid off at the same time. It was just interest being paid off, pretty simple. So I'm going to be able to knock off 2 and 4 as my answer choices because I know that it was interest-only loans way back then. And then they're asking, after the Depression, what is the primary form of repayment for residential mortgage financing? Well, it's the long-term, fully amortized mortgages. Okay, so it's not graduated payment mortgages. So that one's false, right? We don't normally pay back our mortgages with graduated payments. We usually pay them back with these long-term, fully amortized mortgages. So answer number 1 is the one that properly fills in both of the blanks. And just like we've had with a couple of other questions, like a couple other question types, I'm just going to get rid of all of this so that you can see what I'm doing here. Just like with a couple of other question types, whatever they mention first in the question is what they have to mention first in the answers, okay? And what they mention second or last, right? Second, third, last, whatever in the question is what they have to mention second in the question. So you notice that they have interest-only loans and long-term fully amortized mortgages, so they have the same answer choice. It's just flipped in answers 1 and 2. But that's an incorrect placement because it wasn't long-term fully amortized mortgages from 1900 to 1920 and interest-only loans after the Depression. It's the other way around. It was interest-only loans between 1900 and 1920, and now it's long-term fully amortized mortgages after the Depression. Okay, so this one just asking about what the motivations would be to invest in real estate. And in fact, it's asking which one is not a motivation. So you would not invest in real estate to have short-term funds to finance the acquisition of chattels. So you don't invest in real estate to have cash in order to go buy stuff. Okay, like we were just saying with a bunch of the other questions, real estate is a longer or a long-term investment. It's considered to be illiquid, so it's difficult to convert to cash because there aren't very many investors, right? Because of that secondary mortgage market, there aren't very many investors out there that are willing to invest in mortgages, and it requires a high outlay of capital, so it takes away your cash from you with that high degree of administrative work, which is costly. They're also unique, and they require much investigation and preparation before an investor would decide to invest, okay? So you don't invest in real estate to go and buy chattels, stuff. You do invest in real estate to have a diversified portfolio. So you want to actually have, like we were talking about before, you want to have your money, right, in different places. Okay, maybe a couple different properties in for investment, maybe a business, right? You want to have like a factory that's going on. Maybe you want to, invest it in some stocks and bonds, right, on the stock exchange, right? You want to buy some Tesla stock, and maybe you want to go and invest in Canadian bonds as well because that's safe. So you want to put your money in a whole bunch of different areas so that you don't have it risked if one of these areas actually fails. If this investment goes, wrong and you lose all your money, then you still have all of your money that's invested in all of these areas. Okay, so that's why you would diversify your portfolio and have that portfolio to benefit from the income from all of these different sources. So that's why numbers 1 and 2 are correct. And you would maybe invest in real estate to have accommodation for residential or economic activities. So you could buy it for your own purposes, or you could have it to generate an income for you from it as well. So that's another way to say answer number 2. Okay, another easy factual question. So which of the following was created by the CMHC, so Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation? So your Canada Housing Trust bonds. So you need to know that one, just factual. You don't need to know anything about any of the other ones. So just know that the Canada Housing Trust bonds was created by CMHC. Okay, so given the nominal rate of interest of 12.921%, the greater the frequency of compounding will do what? So will it lower the payments to the borrower? Will it lower the effective annual rate? Will it be a higher rate per compounded period? Or will it be a higher yield to the lender? So hopefully you know what the answer is for this without needing to do any math. So when we talked about the yield questions, when we did our yield section, there were two ways that you could compare interest rates. When you had all the J's in the same frequency, so they were all in the same frequency of compounding, you could compare the J's. So that was a lot of the times in our questions where we would take a J rate or a bunch of J rates, and we would convert them all to J1, and then we would compare and see which one is the best one. Okay, so that's how you can compare. That's one way that you can compare. The other way that you can compare is if the interest rate is the same. If the interest rate is the same, even though the compounding periods are different, we should know that the greater the compounding means the more money, the more interest that's going to be earned on that calculation. Okay, so in this list, this J1 is going to earn the least amount of interest dollars. Why? Because it's only compounded one time per year. The one that's going to earn the most amount of interest dollars is the one that's going to be compounded 12 times per year. So it's not going to lower the payments to the borrower. It's not going to lower the effective annual rate. It's not going to have a higher rate per compounding period. What it's going to do is it's going to raise the yield. It's going to increase the yield to the lender. Why? Well, because of what I just said. Because it's going to increase the amount of interest that the lender is going to earn. Now, if you're not sure about that, you can impeppen each of these, right? You can make up some stuff and you can impeppen these into the same J and compare them and see what happens. So I would leave the J1 as it is. Oops, a little bit of dyslexia happening there. I would leave the J1 as it is, and I would convert the others to a J1 in order to see what happens to the rate, right? To compare and to see what this J1 is equal to at the end. And you would see that eventually when you did all of these, that the interest rate for the J12 is going to be the highest one. Okay, so this J1 is going to be the highest one out of all of them. How do I know that? Because it's the greatest number of compounding periods, right? So I want to compare. I can either have all the J's be in the same compounding periods, or I can have the interest rate be the same, and I can compare using the compounding periods and what I know from the math. So for this one, it would be J12 equals 12.921, and I want to convert to the J1. Okay, so if you need to do this, then that's okay, then you can. But hopefully you know from the concepts that we've covered that it'll be the highest one for the J12 at the conversion. And you notice that I've written down the full impeppen, but I stopped at my J effective because that is my J1. I will get this same answer if I continued on and finished that. So I'm only going to do my NPE for each one of these because I'm lazy and I don't like to do work if I don't need to. So you see that we're increasing the interest rate as we go along because we're increasing the compounding periods. So 13.714. So you see that this one is the highest out of all of them, right? It kicks this one's butt. And it's 13.714. So the higher the yield to the lender. So if I increase those compounding periods, right? If I keep the rate the same and I increase the compounding periods, right, this starting rate the same, but I increase the compounding periods, it actually increases the yield. Because what does it do? It increases the amount of interest that the lender is able to collect from that borrower. Okay, and a lot of people say, oh, why is 3 wrong? Because then, yeah, it would be higher. No, it's actually less because per compounding period, you would divide this by 12. Per compounding period, you would divide this by 4. Per compounding period, you divide this by 2. And per compounding period, you would divide this by 1. So 12.921 divided by 2 is 6.46. 0 per compounding period. 12.921 divided by 4 is 3.230 per compounding period. And 12.921 divided by 12 is 1.0767 per compounding period. So it's actually lower per compounding period because there are more compounding periods. Okay, so that's why this one is incorrect. Okay, so another set, 920 and 920 new. So this one is asking for the true, and the bottom one is asking for the false. Okay, so the true answers here are B and D. So a lender may apply a higher loan-to-value ratio to an insured loan than an uninsured loan when we have mortgage insurance. Okay, so they might allow you to have a higher loan-to-value ratio. And what does the loan-to-value ratio do? Remember, when I increase the loan-to-value ratio, I increase the amount of mortgage monies that the lender is willing to give. So if I have an insured mortgage, then the lender might be willing to bump this up. So instead of saying, I'm only going to give you 75% loan-to-value ratio, I'm willing instead to give you 90% loan-to-value ratio, which would increase my M, right? And that increases the amount of money that the borrower is given. Mortgage default insurance is insurance for the lender. It absolutely is. The borrower pays for that insurance, but it is to protect the lender. So B and D are the true. these are false. The insurance company guarantees that the borrower will be able to continue making his mortgage payments without interruption. It's not a guarantee for the borrower. Again, it is for the lender. So it guarantees that the lender will be able to reclaim all of their capital that they've invested. And C is false. It says the insurance premium paid on an insured mortgage cannot be added to the loan amount. Absolutely, yes, it can. 920 new is asking for the false statement. So number one is true. So a lender may apply a higher loan-to-value ratio to an insured loan than an uninsured loan. Yes. The insurance premium paid on an insurance mortgage can be added to the loan amount. Yes. And mortgage default insurance is insurance for the lender. Yes. Your false statement is that the insurance company guarantees that borrowers will be able to continue to make their mortgage payments without interruption. That is a false statement. It's not about the borrowers being able to make the mortgage payments. It's about the lender being able to recover their losses. Okay, so whatever hasn't been paid by the borrower, it allows them to be able to collect that from the insurance policy. Okay, so 926 is asking about fully amortized constant payment mortgages. And this one again is asking when payments are rounded up to the next higher dollar, the number of payments necessary to repay the loan will do what? So remember I said they might decline in addition to reducing the size of the final payment. So we're definitely going to have a lower payment for the final payment, the last one. And we may actually have a decrease in the amount of payments, especially when we round it to the next higher dollar or next higher $10. So this one here is false for a couple reasons. It's saying it's always going to increase the amount of payments in addition to increasing the size of the final payment. So that one's all wrong in all ways. It doesn't increase the length of the term. So the point of rounding up that payment is to actually pay everything off in that term period. And so the borrower doesn't breach, right? Doesn't default on their contract. And answer number 4 is just silly. Okay, 997 is saying which of the following is not a reason why an investor would use borrowed funds instead of an all-cash offer for a real estate investment. So we've talked about this a whole bunch of times. This one is asking for what is not the reason. So reasons is to diversify investments and reduce overall risk. That is a reason why an investor would use borrowed funds. To invest the borrowed funds at a higher rate of interest than the borrowing rate, right? So they're going to make some money by investing high and borrowing low. And because they might have a lack of capital to actually pay for the investment, so they have to use borrowed funds. So those are all reasons why they would. The one that they wouldn't have as a reason is to get a regular and predictable return on capital. So real estate investment is not for regular or predictable return. You don't know exactly what your return is going to be. You're investing for long or longer terms, and you get the entire yield or profit or return when you sell that investment, right? With the majority of it. And so the regular return example is better given as a term deposit, right? That you know. When you put your money in a term deposit, you know exactly what you're going to get out of it. When you put your money in a savings account, you know exactly what you're going to get out of it. Real estate, not so much.
बढ़िया आप बताओ कैसे अच्छा अच्छा बढ़िया हाँ जी बाकी ठीक है आलस आया हुआ है बारिश हो रही है बाहर ठंडा मौसम है इसलिए आलस आया हुआ है कुछ टॉपिक पे आए थे हाँ जी बाकी बढ़िया हाँ सब ठीक है आपका हो गया पासपोर्ट वगैरह नंबर चेंज करा लिया उस पर टिकट्स वगैरह पे करवा लिया था चेंज टिकट्स पे चेंज करवा लिया अच्छा 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 ठीक है फिर तो सही है तो कोई दिक्कत नहीं हाँ जी हाँ जी अच्छा अच्छा चलो वो भी ठीक है बोलो बिल्कुल बोलो। हम्म, हाँ जी हाँ जी। नहीं नहीं कुछ नहीं, वो आ रहे हैं आपके पास सामान आ रहा है वो आने जाने वाला। अच्छा, हाँ वो अलग अलग आएंगे ना। हाँ, सारों के सप्लायर अलग हैं तो अलग अलग ही भेजेंगे। आपने अपना सामान रखना शुरू कर दिया लगेज वगैरह में? हम्म, हम्म। बाकी मेरे ख्याल से अप्रैल एंड तक तो मौसम ठीक हो जाएगा, मतलब इतनी कोई जैकेट वगैरह की तो ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ेगी, और यहाँ इतनी हमारे पास है तो मतलब आपको तो लाने की ज़रूरत ही नहीं है। हाँ तो भारी कपड़ों की तो मुझे नहीं लगता कपड़ों की ज़रूरत पड़ेगी। मैं तो भारी कपड़ों की ज़रूरत तो नहीं पड़ेगी इस टाइम, मई वगैरह में तो गर्मी हो जाएगी तो कोई हैवी कपड़े की ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ेगी। जैकेट तो बहुत है वहाँ यहाँ पे, जैकेट की कमी नहीं है। अगर आपको मतलब सर्दी ठंडी ठंडी हवा भी चली तो यहाँ बहुत जैकेट ठंडी की गर्मी दोनों ही बहुत है।